Welcome to the Oregon Coast Railroad. The OCRR is a freelance HO scale layout loosely based on the Astoria branch of the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railroad. The time is 1957. If you have any questions or comments, you're certainly welcome to contact me. I built my Swift plant to keep a two-person crew busy through a 3-hour operating session. This all got started in the early 2000s when I had the chance to operate on Paul Dulcus's old Boston and Maine layout. The premier job was working the White Mountain Paper Company. I never had the seniority for it, but watching others, it was very intriguing. And when I read Paul's article in Model Railroader, that really opened my eyes to how much more than just running from town to town could be done on a layout built for operations. I decided I wanted something like that on the layout I was going to start building soon. Then, just about the time I started to build, Doug Harding's two-part article on meatpacking plants came out in Railroad Model Craftsman. Well, I had my industry. My railroad starts in Northwest Portland at the Hoy Street Yard, and in North Portland there was a Swift plant. Here's a Decker plant that Doug talked about in his article. As you can see, it's a big industry. Lots of buildings, lots of track, serving lots of cars. You look at some of the numbers here, you realize this is just a busy place. This plant, Decker, was in Mason City, Iowa. But packing plants were not just a Midwest industry. Packing plants were common all the way across the nation during the steam and transition era. Swift alone had at least 50 packing plants. One of the things that's fun about having a packing plant is they used company reefers, and those cars often come in more colorful than just a string of boxcar red cars we were so used to during the transition era. I have cars from Intermountain, Red Caboose, Atlas, and Rapido. Manufacturers tend to release these cars in batches, and once they've been released, they get sucked up into the market and it's hard to find more cars. I solved that problem some by buying some Rapido kits, Rapido kits, and some tissue decals and made my own. I now have a fleet of about 25 Swift cars serving this plant. Packing plants had an amazing variety of products. Some of the products they produced themselves, sometimes they produced byproducts that were then shipped out to other locations to be made into a final product. What this means in the world of operations is there are many different car types that go in and out of packing plants. And that's just another thing that makes the layout or makes the operation so interesting. Here's what I built. It's the largest industry on my basement size layout, but it also would make just a great switching layout all by itself. And I tend to talk about this as if it's just a Swift packing plant, but in fact it's co-located with the Portland Union Stockyards, which is its own separate industry. During my operating sessions, probably 40 or 50 cars come in and go out of Swift, and also internal to Swift, reefers are moved several different times. That's yet another thing that makes a meatpacking plant such an interesting industry for operations. And Swift has met my expectations. The operators are busy most of the session, and it's easy for me to gin up extra traffic if in fact they get a little bit ahead of what I had planned. My layout was in the Great Model Railroad's 2014. You can see from this picture what a big industry this is. One of the things I like about a large industry is without stopping to count them, you're not even sure how many cars are here. Since that picture, I had a chance to operate on Chuck Hitchcock's old Argentine industrial district, and I worked a branch house there. That gave me the idea to add an inspection track and a bone meal platform to my Swift plant, so I've done that. I also moved an ice plant around. It used to be in the yard. It just happened in the Hoyt Street yard. It just happened to fit right there, so I moved it. And I've added this interchange track. In the prototype, there was a runaround track and two interchange tracks, one for the SP&S and one for the Union Pacific. I don't have room right now, but I could chop away a little bit more of the hillside and create room for at least one, and I'm thinking about that. We'll see. So now on to operations. Here's a graphic of my layout. You can see Hoyt Street Yard and Swift are very closely located. I operate the railroad using timetable and train authority. And it's just very hard to do that when there's only a few feet separating them. So in my case, Swift is inside the Hoyt Street yard limits. All the activity between Hoyt Street and Swift are between the Hoyt Street yard master and the switching crew that goes out to Swift. The layout dispatcher has no contact with this part of the operation at all. Here's the same story in a photograph. You can see Hoyt Street Yard in the background. The red circle is the turnout that the yard transfer uses to back into the Swift facility. You also notice here I have a 4-foot aisle so the two people who are operating the Swift plant can stand beside Swift and work it, and trains that go from Hoyt Street and further west, their crews can walk behind the operating crew at Swift. There's no interference between the two of them. As is true for the prototype, I have a terminal district railroad serving Swift. And as I've already said, Swift is within the Hoyt Street yard limits, so the crew actually works for the Hoyt Street yard master as opposed to working for the dispatcher. And the way this process works is a switcher with a few cars bound for Swift leaves as the first or second train at the beginning of every trick. Once the crew gets to Swift, that's where they continue to work until the end of the trick. I use switch lists for these cars, both inbound and outbound. I have used car cards in the past, and you may see some in pictures, but it's very confusing to crews when refrigerator cars in particular have so many internal movements. And I think I've mentioned this before, outbound cars return to Hoyt Street. Hoyt Street is where they're put into trains for further movement to wherever it is they're going. Here we are with a Swift transfer leaving the Hoyt Street yard. I've talked about the variety of cars that go in and out of Swift, and in this yard transfer you can see 8 cars, and there are 5 or 6 different kinds. One of the SOPs on the Oregon Coast Railroad, which was common to the prototype, is stock cars are placed immediately behind the engine. The reason for that is as the slack is pulled up, hopefully with the cars right behind the engine, it won't cause the animals to fall or be injured. And even knowing the fate of animals when they get to the stockyard, animals that arrive injured are not suitable for packing plants. Here's the Swift transfer backing into the Swift plant. In this picture, we're still within yard limits. As Lance Menheim taught us in his book about switching, railroads just don't barge into industrial plants and start moving cars left and right. This is a customer site, and they need to do work that the customer wants done and in the order the customer needs it done. So what happens is the train arrives, the conductor comes and talks to the company rep. You can see him there, Mac. And between them, they arrange for the work that needs to be done that day. If Mac isn't there when the train arrives, he leaves a note in the mailbox. And strangely enough, in 50 or 60 operating sessions on the Oregon coast, Mac has never been there. So instead, there's a note in the Swift mailbox, which is directly under the turnout that leads into the packing plant. Mac represents Swift. Swift is a demanding customer, so Mac makes a couple of points in his note. One of them is that the inspection track and the icing and cooling track can only hold 4 cars at a time. If there are more than 4 cars that need either one of these services, crews need to make 2 sets of movements to serve them. The other thing Mac reminds them is that with stock cars, the stock car doors need to be lined up with the ramps into the stock pens. That could take juggling of individual cars, and the reason is I have 36-foot, 40-foot, and 50-foot stock cars on the railroad. I think this sensitivity to customer demands adds another touch of realism to operating the packing plant. This picture shows some of the variety of cars that come in and out of Swift. Even here you can see 40-foot and 50-foot stock cars, wooden reefers that need icing, mechanical reefers, and a tank car that carries propane. You might also notice that inbound reefers may be carrying hanging meat. That's because not every plant did the same thing, and so meat may be moved from one plant to another to finish its processing. There also could be a lot of inbound hanging meat at special times, for instance, pork around Easter. Here's some more of the great variety of cars that serve a packing plant. The empty gondola is in front of an empty platform that normally would hold bone meal. This tank car is delivering heating oil. You also see a boxcar there that I call a hide car. It actually has a proper lettering to designate it as a hide car. And of course the issue there is once hides are loaded into a car, the car is considered contaminated and can't be used for anything else. So hide cars tended to be box cars or gondolas that were at end or nearly the end of their service life. This last picture shows yet another tank car. Tank cars brought many products in to help in the processing of products in a cannery, in a packing plant. And they also took out a lot of byproducts to move them on to other places where they're turned into finished products. This is also a good picture of the inspection facility at my Swift plant. This facility is really just for the final inspection of cars by Department of Agriculture inspectors. It is not where cars are normally cleaned. What kind of cars should be at Swift and in what kind of numbers? Well, here's a rough metric. 2.5 stock cars equal 1 loaded reefer. And so in other words, 50 stock cars per day would equal 20 reefers per day. Nobody ever sees that exactly because cars are coming in and out all the time, but what it really means is my Swift plant has a lot of stock cars and a lot of reefers. All the other cars that might be in that handle other inbound or outbound products are really one-ofs. As a matter of fact, some of them, like the hide car, may stay in place for 2 or 3 tricks. So here's a look at the operating scheme at Swift. You can see on track 1 is the icing plant, icing and cooling. On track 2, in the part closest to us, are some stock pens. Further back are the product doors that I consider to be where products would be loaded into reefers. Track 3, where the engine and the 2 tank cars are, really serves the other side of the plant, and that's mostly where inbound materials go, although outbound byproducts like canned meats could also come out on that side. Track 4 in this picture is really sort of a runaround track and a tail for switching, but also on track 4 closer to us and out of this picture are some additional stock pens. And track 5 is the inspection track. I've mentioned a couple of times that reefers have multiple movements within the plant. The first thing that happens is a reefer is moved to the inspection track. Once it's been inspected, it comes over step 2 for the icing and cooling track. And step 3, it's moved to the main plant where the car is loaded. You might notice that each of these steps in the reefer process have times attached to them. Those times are real minutes. I run the layout on a 3-to-1 clock, but I use real minutes for the time between the steps for reefers because it's timed using kitchen timers. And of course, they come in real time. So once the switch crew has put reefers on the inspection track, they set the timer for 7 minutes and they can't move the cars to step 2 until that timer has gone off. Actually, during most operating sessions, if I don't hear timers going off occasionally, I do go over and talk to the crew. A few more things about working the Swift plant. When a crew arrives in the morning, they can assume that any cars that have been at Swift over the last trick are now ready for their next movement. Also, as I mentioned before, every car that departs Swift goes back to the Hoyt Street track. During an operating session, the Hoyt Street yardmaster can get 30 or 40 cars that are bound for Swift. He has two different ways to get them moved over to Swift. One is he can choose to just have his switcher haul those cars over to the Swift plant, and while he's there, bring back any cars ready for Hoyt Street. But more likely, because the Swift job is within yard limits and the Swift crew works for the yard master, he will simply call them and tell them to bring back any cars they have ready for Hoyt Street and to come pick up the cars he needs them to get out of his yard and to bring them back over to Swift. There is one exception to the cars going back to Swift, and that is very late in the op session, I will have a train come from the west, which is the direction 104 is now pointing. It's a stock extra with 7 or 8 cars. It'll pull in. The Swift crew will come out, hook on to the stock cars, pull them into the plant, and get them unloaded. In the meantime, the extra will reshuffle itself in its caboose to get ready to go back to the west. Once the Swift crew is done emptying the cars, they'll bring them back out to the interchange track. The extra's engine can hook onto the cars, and once he has his orders, he can depart again back to the west. With that, all of the Swift crew's job is done for this trick, and they can come back to Hoyt Street with any other cars that are ready to go there. The more I work with Swift, the more I learn there is to do and not do with a packing plant. I've chosen to not worry too much about a couple of things. The prototype car cleanout was done at the SP&S's Vancouver yard, and that's also where reefers were repaired. Yeah. Excuse me, I'm happy with that story, so that's the way we do it. I have not incorporated weighing cars into my scenario. I could, and Doug Harding recently pointed out to me that the only reefers that need loading are the ones that are carrying hanging meat. Any outbound product cars that have packaged material, clerks can just add up the weight of the packages. They don't need to actually weigh the cars. So I'm planning to add weighing. I don't deal with sheep much. As a teenager, I lived on a cattle ranch in eastern Oregon, and like most ranch hands, I'm not sheep friendly. Really doesn't mean much to the operators, since they don't really load or unload whatever stock is in the stock cars. I also don't deal with hogs. Hogs are very weather sensitive and normally would be unloaded into covered stock pens, and I don't have any of those in the layout. And also, not dealing with hogs means I don't need double deck stock cars, and I don't need double deck ramps for the stock pens. I also don't make any distinction in handling for the ice reefers and the mechanical reefers. Both of them get inspected, and then on step 2, both of them get moved over to the icing and cooling track. In theory, the wooden reefers would receive ice. The mechanical reefers would simply have their refrigeration units started, and then all those cars sit there for the next 40 real minutes or 2 fast hours until they're cooled down. I also had mentioned that Swift is co-located with the Portland Union Stockyard, which is really its own industry. I don't incorporate it into my play right now, but the stockyard could receive animals that are then sold to another buyer, and that buyer then has them loaded back onto stock cars and moved off to wherever the buyer wants them. I've thought about doing that. The only hard part about that, the only catch is really need to use reefers that are, stock cars that are easy to distinguish. Stock cars have small lettering and small numbers, and it really gets to be a pain for crews to try to figure out if you just want one of a long string of stock cars to be treated differently. So I'd use like the green and yellow of Chicago Northwestern. Um, there are also a whole lot of byproducts that come out of the meat packing process that I just don't incorporate into the play. Another thing I could have happen is flat cars, gondolas, box cars, or even otherwise empty stock cars could be bringing in hay and other feed. It's a legitimate activity. I just haven't incorporated it into the play. I'm pretty happy the way things go on the stockyard now, or at the meatpacking plant. But there are some things I could add. I've mentioned already increasing the stockyard traffic. I've also thought about adding at least one more interchange traffic so I could have a train coming out of Hoyt Street that actually stopped and picked up reefers or other cars. And Intermountain came out with some PFE meat reefers with a proper number series. That was a couple of years ago, and if I happen to stumble across any of those, it'd be kind of fun to add them to the layout. So that's really my story. Railway Bull Shippers Group, great source for information, mainly because the guru of meat packing plants is Doug Harding. Doug makes a lot of comments on that blog, and he also has added a lot of files. Doug also is the guy who wrote the two-part article on Railroad Model Craftsman, and you want to take a look at that if you're at all interested in incorporating a packing plant on your layout. Jeff Wilson did his normal good job with the Kalmbach book on livestock and meat packing. I like Steve Sandifer's new book. It really came out after I'd already built everything I need to have built. But it's an interesting book. It's really much more focused on moving stock than it is on packing plants. Very interesting, though, particularly if you live in the West. That's everything I have to tell you. Again, comments or questions, ocrr@comcast.net. Thanks for listening. Bye.